Hey guys, I hope you had a great weekend. I wanted to make a quick video just to reflect on our experience together last Friday and give you a little bit of guidance as you start thinking more about your individual projects. And so in the email that I'm sending you, there are a series of steps that I'm going to suggest you begin with to help you think about what your research project might look like. So the first thing to think about here, right, is your research can focus on students, it could focus on educators, or it could focus on administration or educational leadership. And that might include even things like competencies, right? Competency-based education, which is something that I've done a little bit of work in. So you can think about whichever area is most interesting to you. And the first thing that I recommend you do is do a little reflective journaling. Don't try to put any sort of educational lingo with it. Just sit down with a nice cup of coffee or hot tea and some paper and just start writing about your observations over the years as a teacher. What are the things that got you energized? What are the things that you found frustrating? What are the things that you're like, I wish I knew more about this, right? And that could look like anything. Just write about it, right? Think about it in terms of your interaction with students, your interaction with other faculty, your role as a faculty. Think about it in terms of educational leadership, the way the system is structured, whatever it might be, right? Just write at this point, right? And the sky's the limit. Whatever interests you, write about that. After you've reflected on that, then I want you to grab our textbook for this course, this How Learning Works, and just read the introduction. The introduction goes over these 8 principles that Jennifer discussed with us on Friday. And these give us some language to frame those reflections. So go and look at your reflections and think about where in your reflections were you thinking about student differences and how that might impact their performance, or prior knowledge, or how they organize knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. Do any of the things that you wrote about fit within one of these principles? If so, that's great. And it might be that even if you were writing about educators or you were writing about educational leadership or administration, perhaps these areas impact one of these areas of student learning in some way. There's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. But if you begin here with reflective journaling, you read the principles, and then you come back to that reflective journal and revise it using the language of these principles, it'll give you a vocabulary that perhaps you can then use to start doing a targeted literature search. And I say a targeted literature search because obviously the educational research literature is large, right? And so you might want to think you want to be very targeted so that you just don't get lost, right? It's the same advice we give our students when they're thinking about a dissertation topic. We want them to be targeted in their search. Broad enough to understand the field, but targeted enough not to get lost in the literature. So just the same advice you give your students, this is what I encourage my students to do, is to do a little journaling if they're kind of lost about where they get excited, and consult the literature. And that's the place you begin, right? Once you do that, then you can begin forming research questions. And after you form those research questions, you can decide, am I writing quantitative research questions, qualitative research questions, or am I doing some sort of mixed methods research question? And for each of those research questions, if I were to answer it well, what sort of data do I need? And do I have access to those data? Right? Either through a secondary data analysis source or through primary data collection. And what's feasible, right? These are meant to be small projects. We want them to be impactful, but they're small projects. These are essentially like pilot studies is a good way to think of these, right? That perhaps you can launch into something more. So you're going to have to do some revision, right? You're going to spend a lot of time probably in these first few steps, right? I said steps 4 through 6, but you might go up and do more reflective writing, right? As you read the literature and as you form research questions, you might journal a bit. So there's this iterative process that's going to happen. And at some point, you're going to land on something that feels right, something that excites you, right? And at that point, you can begin drafting what might be a study design, right? And you can begin to identify a data set. You can draw some DAGs if it's quantitative, or an interview guide if it's qualitative. You can begin bouncing your ideas off your colleagues, right? If you're within a department and you're going to work within departments, you can do this activity together. You can bring it to the larger group. You could bounce it off your department head or other colleagues in the school, whatever makes sense to you, just to help refine your ideas. And then you can bring that forward to our February meeting where we can continue the discussion. So that's my advice. I hope that helps. I hope it's not too pedantic. It's the kind of advice we give students, but sometimes, right, as faculty, we don't always remember the basics for ourselves. And so I think in this situation, it's helpful to go back to the beginning. Use the same advice you give your student, and I think you might find it helpful. Okay, so in addition to that, I wanted to revisit a conversation with Elena and Heather around, could you use the development of curriculum as a research project? And the answer is yes, right? If it's done correctly, right? It still has to be a research project. You just can't write a paper about how I developed this curriculum. There needs to be a little bit more rigor to it. And so I give an example here. This is from Rosh Hagag a few years back, when all the It's Your Game stuff was being done in health promotion, of both a quantitative and a qualitative approach to publishing how curriculum was developed. So I just thought I'd share that with you really quick. You can see this one is, I believe, the quantitative approach. And I'm going to scroll down really quick. And with this one, I believe they were doing acceptability, usability, and feasibility with a small group of folks, right? I think they maybe had 8, 10 folks. It's been a long time since I've read this article, but they did some feasibility testing about their paper or about their proposed curriculum, and then they made revisions, right? So that's a quantitative approach. A qualitative approach is, for example, this native It's Your Game, in which they formed a CAB. In your situation, maybe it would be a group of students, and get feedback, qualitative feedback on the proposed curriculum, right? And so this is something that I give to you as an example. Obviously, I'm not saying you need to follow these approaches, but it gives you food for thought about how you might add some rigor to wanting to write up a paper around curriculum development, because it still needs to be a research project this semester. You just can't write up something you've already done. All right. I hope you guys find this useful. If you have any questions, do reach out to me. In this email, I'm going to send a poll to schedule our next meeting. And you guys have a great week.